Well, first of all, thank you for coming, and hope you're all well. Keep your mask on, please. Yeah, okay. And a big thank you to Becky, who accepted obviously to come and be in conversation with our artist, Andrea Gregson, just in case. So nothing else at the moment, except after the talk, you obviously are welcome to stay. Welcome to see more of the exhibition, talk to Andrea again, and then we'll be serving tea and cake. You will have to keep distance, or try to keep distance, because obviously you need to take your mask off to eat and drink, yes.
There's a prize for anybody who can eat it without taking a mask off.
And I've got a very special cake. So,
Danielle, can I ask you what time you'll be doing that? Because there's so much to explore.
I think myself, I'm here, I don't move, so I don't get one. But I think the audience will say 40 minutes to start with, and then there will be some questions.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so we can carry on, and then yes.
All right.
Would that make it yes? So please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a rainy afternoon. I'm really delighted to do this. I should say I've known Andrea since I was about 25 or something, and so we kind of go back a long way. So it feels like I'm sitting with my sister or something. So please excuse me if we sort of wander into talking about vegetables or children. I'll try not to. But I'm really delighted to be able to do this. I feel some people know me here, and I like talking. I talk for a living partly, and but I'm quite daunted at navigating Andrea through this and being responsible for making sure we talk about all the things I feel like we should be talking about, because the show has such a huge amount of scope, and I feel like we could have this conversation about one work. So that kind of responsibility to try and pull things together. I'm just, like Carl said earlier, I'm lowering the bar now, for me anyway. I think one of the things that, it's just the most lovely, generous, enjoyable, thrilling, appetizing, thoughtful body of work. And one of the things that really that fascinates me is the kind of intensity of time and the different scopes and scales of types of time embedded in the show. Both Andrea's time, and one of the things that I'm really interested to talk about is how the work has developed, because there are things that are very new, things that are older, things that have had different life journeys. So the works themselves have kind of changing life journeys, but also Andrea's personal time, the lengths of time involved in some of the processes, the time involved in getting to know components to make pieces of work, the time of the materials themselves, geological time and processing time, and even the times at particular places. There's in conversation with Andrea, there's about 4 or 5 very specific places kind of knitted in to the body of work. That's an awful lot compressed together very elegantly. So I'm going to attempt to perform some structure to kind of guide Andrea through it. One of the things I want to draw Andrea into later, perhaps the third thing we talk about, is glamour, and what a glamorous show it is. It has a kind of peculiar sort of glamour of surface, which is quite odd considering how mucky some of the materials were at some point. In my head, I've named Andrea's show The Hotel at the End of the World. That's my take on it. So one of the things we thought we would start by talking about, and I was going to say, if you have a burning question, I really don't mind if you want to weave it in, because sometimes by the time you've sat on it for 10 minutes, it sort of has got stuck with other things on top of it. So just wave, and then we can have a more conversation afterwards as well. I I'm really interested in the types of labour and making processes embedded in the work, and the relationship between Andrea's making process and the making process of the world. So we thought, because we're on the ground floor, that we'll focus most on the ground floor work and kind of draw a kind of mental thread to the work upstairs. But I'd really like to hear you talk about the work over there, which I've got all sorts of names for, probably all.
Itinerant moraine?
Yes, yeah.
Aluminium.
So, I'm really interested to hear you talk about how that work happened and what the components are, its placement.
So that piece is actually, I feel like it's quite central to all of the show, and not only in the sort of the substance of it, but actually the kind of the thinking around my research interests. I was doing a residency in Glen Nevis for a couple of weeks, and I didn't know what I would do there. I just took a material toolkit with me to see what I might try out in the landscape. And I was really interested in went into the museum locally and found that Ben Nevis is this collapsed caldera, which is a chance kind of geological event which creates the biggest mountain in the UK. And it has all these kind of knock-on effects. So, the mountain needs to be climbed by people because people want to go to the top of the mountain and to feel like maybe they've kind of, they've climbed nature and they've conquered it in some way. So it's got this long history. There used to be a hotel on the top of Ben Nevis. And whilst I was on my residency, there was a helicopter circling around and looking for a person that had been up on the mountain and shouldn't have been up on the mountain. And subsequently actually died on the mountain. It was quite sort of compelling and worrying and at the same time a terrible event which happened. But I was also interested in the fact that the mountain itself, because of its geological structure, had a aluminium smelter below. So the sort of hydroelectric power that had been set up, I think, probably in the early 1900s, something like that. It rerouted some of the water from the loch through the mountain and out, and so it created this, through the sort of incline of the sides, created this space to smelt metal from raw bauxite into sort of ingots. So, and also that funding from that company were funding the local partnership, landscape partnership, who went up Ben Nevis to collect all the waste and the litter from all the people walking up the mountain. So there's a strange kind of sense of about kind of human labour, but also how we kind of act in the landscape. And I felt like I wanted to try, as an artist, to try and replicate some of that activity. So I carried up all my casting kit and my rucksack. I looked like a walker. I had my walking gear on, and then I found a suitable spot. I wasn't actually on Ben Nevis, I was in Glen Nevis, so I could look at the mountain, but I could reflect on this space, and found this glacial boulder. And the boulder had rolled down and settled, and it had really interesting markings on it. And I thought, this is a piece of waste material from nature, and I'm this kind of itinerant maker trying to kind of process what's going on in this space, this recycling of material. And so I made a casting over like quite a long period of time within the day with wax, and it was very slow. And I had to think about how I'd get it off and out down this mountain and carrying and cradling it down this wax, and how do I keep hold of it? Because I didn't want to use the usual things, which might be silicone casting, or I wanted to sort of take this kind of different approach. And then I took that into the space, and then I later kind of reprocessed it, so a bit like a kind of an artist reprocessing space. But the actual physical objectness of sculpture, I feel like, is a way of it's a bit like a sort of it's a different way of looking at industry, because in sculpture you're reprocessing materials in some shape or form. Whether you're casting or whether you're carving, you're still kind of reprocessing material. And then it kind of developed through the work with the foundry. And then as I was knocking out the piece, all the waste material of the casting were kept, because they have that kind of physical feeling that they look like pieces of, a bit like nature's rubble, or sort of material that's left over in that kind of geological process, but actually it's the material left over in sculpture. so that they kind of like came together in that way. So it's very slow. A lot of my work's really slow, and it usually happens over like quite a long period of time. It takes a while to kind of for it to materialise.
One of the things I love about that, and again, you know, aluminium, you know, an artist material, it has a particular history, obviously less elevated than bronze, but it also looks like a battered satellite dish.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things I love about your work is there are these kind of quite sort of lofty, elevated materials, and kind of, you know, references to Brancusi and Picasso, and you know, a kind of you know, high status, historically revered artistic heritage, and then there's a plastic bottle top and a squirty cream and a sink trap, and that kind of oscillating between the status of materials and that as a crinkly, battered satellite dish. And you know, to begin with, I doubt myself and my kind of slightly childish pursuit, you know, looking, you know, having these sort of reference points that maybe are not quite intended, but I think that's slightly, it's both like battered satellite dish and also fallen sun. You know, it's kind of this radial form with these bits spewing out. And then we were laughing earlier because Andrew was telling me, he was talking about these objects that are hollowed out and how they're kind of soulless. And every time she said soulless, I thought she said soulless. And I was like, how do you spell that? And I became really interested in this kind of evoking of the sun. And then I realised there were these sort of sun things. And again, you know, it was kind of a slightly slight reference, but I started to think about the kind of energy to make the forms, the evoking, you know, the evoking of kind of moon and sun and energy and water. So this compressing of kind of the really mundane and the cheap and the throwaway and the epic and the grandiose. I find incredibly enjoyable.
Oh, thank you. Well, I do as well. I find that enjoyable, of finding these objects so that they, you know, I tend to sort of, as I go about my normal life, I find things along the way and I keep them for safekeeping somewhere. And then sometimes it can take a while. I just collect things and then they enter into the work or they don't enter into the work. But there's quite a lot of sifting going on. But I like the play with the hierarchy, because, you know, through art history, there's these hierarchy of materials. I like putting things together that shouldn't be together, and to try and destabilise it, particularly with the aluminium, because yeah, you're right, it's more domestic, it's more sort of humdrum objects that tend to be aluminium, like you know, that fencing and crockery, pans and things, you know, utensils. Yeah, it's got an interesting kind of place in the sort of material archive and material pecking order that we have decided on as a species, that there is this sort of hierarchy of materials, and I like that placing, replacing, playing, shifting.
Can I ask, like, there's I can't think what word you used then, but and it sounds like such a derogative word, but the word clutter comes to mind a lot when I you know, I'm a very untidy person, so I think about clutter a lot. And you know, in a way, you talked about the boulders on the hillside. They're kind of natural clutter. These are, you know, they're hoarders clutter. And I'm really reminded of Walter Benjamin and arcades, and there's a brilliant essay that I know some people here will know by Esther Leslie, called something like
Cheerful Destruction of the Soul.
That's the one. Yeah,
that one.
Thank you. Cheerful Destruction of the Self, and it's on Esther Leslie's website. And she just talks about Benjamin's like anxiety about clutter, and he loves clutter. He collects clutter, and he loves all the mass of social, the kind of clutter of social reference points in a kind of contemporary world. But he's also really agonised because he also is a modernist, and he wants to be modern, and he wants to be minimal, and he wants to join the futurists and throw all the clutter away and get rid of history. And there's this sort of similar, oscillation around, like not only is the like physical, I mean, I'm not for 1 minute saying it looks cluttered or that you display in a cluttered way, but this sort of thing about social kind of aggregate clutter, things that come from all sorts of places, all whopped together in the same way that you find building aggregate on a beach, and the social references. And I find it incredibly exhilarating to see so many art historical references to a particular 30s vibe. I kind of feel Magritte in the work upstairs with the fungus on the stick. I feel Picasso over there, and I have a Hepworth vibe at times, and I have a Merritt Oppenheim kind of slither, and they're of a particular from the Surrealists, but also it makes me think about those things as clutter and part of how we read the work, as well as material clutter.
I like that when you say the social aggregate. That is definitely it, because I keep things back. But I think the thing that connects those artists, I mean, that's amazing you see that in the work, is that one sense of wonder. I think that's the kind of connection, because I suppose that part of art history, there's a sort of sense of wonderment about objects and and repurposing objects. And when it happens at different points in art history, doesn't it? With Arte Bavaria and different stages in art history. But
what does it mean to evoke that? Because what I find it like, I'm really exhilarated and kind of struck by the evocation of that particular history now in a context of thinking about the environment. And those things don't feel like they go together very often. What was it about that time, or what type of time is being reworked by thinking about it from our perspective now?
Well, thinking about it now, I think it happens. I've always had that interest in materials and objects, and it's something that I suppose it comes from a sort of background of not wanting to waste things, saving things, repurposing things because they could be useful, but also having a visual interest in, as a kind of sculptural perspective and lens into object making. It does have a special kind of connection now when you think about the kind of the emergency of the climate debates that we're having at the moment, and so I think that all of that is kind of tied into it because of the I suppose like how thinking about the waste that I create, I collect some of that waste in the work, because a lot of these objects they started off by thinking about future objects, future materials from things that we've just thrown away. So they're all made, they look quite elegant, sort of lifted off their legs, but they're actually made from waste materials in the foundry, sort of tin foil and plastic bags. They're all things from, they're kind of harboured and sculpted in a way so that they're all inside out, using this kind of traditional Renaissance method of casting, using the core, which, going back to Benji and thinking about the idea of the soul in the object and the aura. So the other kind of name for the core in Italian, the Italian method of bronze casting is anima, which means soul. And I kind of was interested in that, these sort of soulless bronze objects, actually trying to invest that into the work in some way by giving it an inside space and an outside space.
What do you mean by core? What is that, core?
Core, so it's something they, not only from the Renaissance, but it's earlier, they used to sculpt a core out of a mould material. It probably would have been clay or earth, and then would build the wax around it, so that you would then, once it was poured and through lost wax, it would create the mould, and then you could knock it out. so what you're seeing on the inside is the kind of the main surface of the work. So it's like turning your jumper or your jacket inside out. That makes sense. So they're all one-offs completely, so they're not mass-produced. So yeah, I do feel like this sort of, just looking at materials and I suppose the sense of respect even to a plastic lid, that it's had this kind of, it's gone through a whole manufacturing process. And
a similar manufacturing process.
Yes,
It's all about like positives and negatives.
And it's not a bad thing, it's a useful thing because it stops foods from decaying, but at the same time it's completely clogging up systems, water systems, and creating problems with microplastics. So there's a whole sort of set of stories around and situations what are happening around materials which are really troubling at the moment. And so my work quietly kind of uses these things in all of the works and the kind of labour, and thinking about that kind of labouring of materials and that historical context of labouring with materials is something that's always really interested me, in that sort of haptic world of objects and making.
Can you say something about because one of the things I love this piece of work behind us, and I think this is where I get my hotel vibe from, because I just imagine, some of it looks like a hotel bell or a trophy or an award at the back of some kind of, so I sort of start thinking, what would that one be an award for? That one would be an award for someone being a complete idiot. That one is, some of them are kind of quite rude looking, like this one here with the kind of trumpet piece. Seems like it should be for Boris Johnson. And there's this sort of really cheeky thing, there's a sort of humour to them. And a lack of a kind of irreverent, but I'm really interested in the way you combine materials, and some of them are really elegant and some of them aren't, and I'm really interested in what your thoughts are about the types of materials you bring together and the way they, what the join is, how they sit together. I wonder if you might talk about some of the sort of jointing in these things, and they're like smacking time together, aren't they? And some of them, although the materials are completely different materials to our understanding, they are actually fundamentally the same material, like oil or.
Yeah.
Would you?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of play that goes on in the making in the studio. So I collect things. I have lots of series of objects in boxes. I just keep them. So I've got a stack of plastic objects, a stack of rocks, stones, flints, a stack of kind of casts from different sort of things that failed, things that succeeded, and then actual broken things, ceramics. So it's like, in a way, it's a bit like slightly autobiographical, because a lot of the objects have passed through my life in some way. I found them, or they found me. I don't know, maybe the objects found me. I happened to be sort of walking around, and then, so for example, this flint nodule was found on a walk, and it just had this kind of sense of a body in it, and you'll see the same flint in the object over there, the sculpture over there, rigmarole. So I'm interested in that sort of interplay, first of all by balance and time, and trying to kind of get a balance between things that are really old, like a kind of deep time of a 100 million year old flint nodule made from like dead sea creatures, maybe sort of soft-bodied sea creatures burrowing underground, to like the plastic squirty cream lid, which is really irreverent, and it was from Lidl, it was cheap, I like that kind of playing around, but actually that's a piece, that's been made from oil. And here's something from millstone brick from Morecambe Bay where I'm from, and which is sort of created all these really beautiful rock structures, which is why I think I'm probably interested in geology in the first place. And things from the Thames that I found, so different, I think that was from the Thames embankment, like a house brick that started to look like, it looks like a natural form. And then mixed up with, some of the parts are partially made with bronze and cast from bronze. And other parts were found, like this piece here, the cuckoo clock weight, was from my grandmother's shop in the northwest. She used to sell what you call fancy goods, and I used to work in it as a child from 7. When I was old enough to work, I was working. And we used to sell all this stuff for tourists, and then sort of things from different times, but because she was involved in council work and she's quite interested in tried to stop the nuclear power station being built in Heysham in Morecambe Bay, but wasn't able to. So she's quite involved in all of that, and at the same time wasn't kind of keeping an eye on all of these objects that perhaps weren't being sold quickly enough, and so she had this decaying stockroom which I used to play in as a child, and I've got now in studio a whole load of these cuckoo clock waste, because I think the cuckoo clock's probably got woodworm and they'd be thrown away. So there's an interesting thing with play and just, I suppose, that kind of thinking about sculpture. I suppose it's all in your head. When you study art, it's there in your head, isn't it? You've seen all these objects, you've been to lots of shows, and it's all in your head. And then trying to the other kind of rule that I have is that they have to fit together. They have to balance before being glued or stuck together. So they all have to stand and sit. So they all do.
So it's never. It's always a kind of a fit based on or
it has to sit.
Joint, a ball and socket or a
completely
already.
And it's bringing all those partial objects together so that they're all broken bits. They're all sort of removed from or obsolete, something obsolete. And there's bits of found bronze from the foundry, like this piece here and this piece here, like somebody's bit of spill out of the work, a bit of the flash, with other objects which evoke, here like it's a sort of jelly mould and a kidney dish from sort of the body. They'll kind of evoke the body in some way. I think the bringing together of those objects was about composing elements.
Can I ask about, when I look at them and when I think, about both the materials and the objects and the genesis of some of the works, I know some of the works are 10 years old, some of the components are 10 years old, and there's this thing about dormancy. I keep thinking about dormancy as something resting or being asleep, and partly it's kind of romantic until the artist has the moment where they're sprung back into life, but also there's the dormancy of materials. We tend to think of things as unchanging, whereas actually, we're looking, if you look at them in a different time period, they're changing all the time, like the mountain. But would you tell us something about one of the works that involves an old thing that has kind of gone on this story? Because I find it, incredibly interesting that I'll see something and I think, I've seen that in your work before, but it's like something in that was dormant that you didn't drag out of it before, you've now found another life. So partly it's reprocessing, but also they're resting at times.
I suppose the thing with the piece upstairs, Spectre, the bracket fungus porcelain installation, that came about from, I made the sculptural work, which is called Order of Events. It's got the original bracket fungus on the top, and the bronze element in that was all, again, it was balanced in its original form, all these plastic, different material objects that fit together. And then I played around with that and then created this kind of object which has it brings together different elements, and I wanted to use that metal pouring process to bring the same kind of life cycle back to bring it to one life cycle, and had the kind of original element of the bracket fungus on top, and that developed into the porcelain cast piece, which was about reproduction, reproducing them into a sort of porcelain casting, and porcelain ware used to be a really high-end, high sort of status object. It has been in the past, more than say silver or gold, and I was interested in that kind of connection between taking something from nature, repurposing it, and then making it into a more desirable object, material, and to sort of put it on its side, because in nature they grow horizontally, but to sort of just flip it on its side, they become like this sort of ears, or they sound like shells, or something to listen into, just to sort of flip it on its side, and to have that dialogue between the original object and its counterpart, its cast, reproduced self through a manufacturing, very slow manufacturing process, because it's me with my 2 or 5 part mould, pressing them in the studio. And I really, really value that, the really kind of perhaps what is the mundane in between processes of sculpture. I find those very meditative, even if just like sanding something down or chopping something or just sort of pressing a mould into a clay. I feel like you're really connecting, grounding yourself in the earth, in the world, in the planet, because you're sort of touching the materials, given that some of the things are man-made, like the plaster has been repurposed from gypsum, and the clay's been sort of dug up and been taken through an industrial process, be bagged up and sold through a kind of clay process. But I just like that kind of, it helps me sort of think about, I don't know, it just, that experience of sculpture has always been something that I really enjoy. And I suppose that's that dialogue really over different time scales. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think what I like, it's that thing about the peculiar like tracking of the myriad of different timescales in like your human life, your like day-to-day life, your the life of the place you live, the life of the places you go to, the kind of geological time, and like at a point you sort of pull all those different timescales together in one moment. So it feels, I think in the text that Rebecca wrote, she talks about sci-fi, and there is something about the kind of almost impossible uniting of timescales. Can I also ask you about bronze casting? Because we don't talk about bronze casting very much. It's not something we associate with contemporary art particularly. So what are the what's it like to be working in bronze now? It's a million miles away from the types of medium I use, and so it's so laden physically, in terms of effort. You have to have the right place to do it, you have to have loads of help, you have to have loads of energy, both yours and, a kind of heating energy. How do you manage that, and how do you, what do you do with them afterwards, I guess, as well? But, I really like when you talk about the kind of Ben Nevis work, that you kind of think about, the work of what it is to be an artist in your time, and your walk up the hill is embedded in it, it's not a separate thing. And again, about the bronze, how do you deal with that as an artist? I mean, it might be there's loads of people doing it and I just don't know, but...
I think it's very slow. I think if you go into commercial foundry and a lot of that kind of multiples and everything, that can be very hands-off. You can give it that, you can farm all that work to somebody else in an industry. But I've been fortunate to have different experiences where I've been able to work hands-on with bronze casting. And so what I've tried to do is to be the opposite of that, is not to be a kind of, sort of like churning things out, but actually just to use it as a space of experimentation and inquiry, and to test out all the different in-between stages and to try and push those as much as possible. So you don't really know where you're going.
So you haven't gone in to go, I want you to make my thing for me.
Yeah, no, so I mean, of course I have to do that sometimes, but it's like, I find that process of play and risk really exciting about it, where one of the first iterations of this piece I did, the first time I ever made one of those, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like, okay, I've got a full box, I've got some clay, I'm just going to like throw some things together and see what happens. And it worked, and so it just started me thinking about this inside-outside interiority, about our insides. The sculpture, does it have guts? Does it have a body? Is it a shell, or has it got a life? Has it got a soul? And then I started to kind of work with that really, and enjoy all of the processes, even the bit which is really hard, which is physically demanding, knocking out the middle bit and trying to polish on the inside. You've got to kind of like really apply yourself. And you can't just be wimpy. You have to sort of like go the full mile. And even if it's like hard work, I've kind of been brought up with graft. My family made me do that as a child, not in a bad way, but in a really good way. I've always had a kind of strong work ethic, and I enjoy it actually. I think again, it's sort of a physical empowering act to be doing that. Also as a female sculptor, I think a lot of these things in the past have perhaps been more less kind of connected to what you might imagine is that female artists might do, so but working with power tools, and I enjoy all of that. I enjoy all that kind of industrial side of it as well. But it's slow burn. It's not always easy, and so sometimes I fail at it quite a lot, and I enjoy that sort of risk element. And then things happen, and then I find something new, and I like that kind of process in a way. But I equally get, I think yeah, there's a whole different side to bronze casting. When I first got Instagram and I put a hashtag on bronze, I was really shocked at what came up. It was sort of bronze bodies, people getting tans. Oh god! So it didn't go anywhere to like sculpture. It was all sort of
bronzes,
looking all like bronzed. And I kind of it's got. And also if you do actually type in bronze sculpture, a lot of the stuff I don't like. A lot of bronze sculptures I don't. I think it's just personal, really, but it's not my thing. But I just like the kind of potential of it, that what you can do with this material, like any other material. I think it's just another material that I enjoy working with, really, as in wood or.
It's interesting just how much heat, the problem of heat in bronze, and when I saw the show first, a lot of the surfaces and colours are quite cool, aesthetically, cold stone. But there's something about the heat or energy that still seems to stay in bronze because it's a reflective material. So coming again, I've thought a lot more about kind of the radiantness of it as a shiny surface, but also it's kind of unlocked by heat and turned into a liquid by heat. So it seems a sort of geological process lives in it, fire and brimstone, which I find, just really exciting. I'd like to ask you about place, because knowing you and what I'm really interested in, I make situated work. So for me, I've always really struggled to make something in one place and take it to another, because it just sits oddly with me, and yet I know that is, and all work has to be made somewhere, and most work for galleries is taken from one place and put in another. But these things come from very specific places, like the Ben Nevis work, and it's unusual to find. The works seem so much about their particular place, and yet you're coordinating them together in a non-place. And I'm interested in hearing about the different places and what it, does their trace or their resonance happen in the work, and what does it mean to bring lots of places together?
That's a great question. I think wherever we go as humans, we take those experiences and take those places into our own kind of memory bank. But I think what I find interesting about sculpture is that, and any other kind of art medium, is that you can bring those together. You can collect those kind of experiences and find a way of using the work to explore some of those things. I think it's quite, that piece over there is called Itinerant Moraine. I do feel like as humans we are itinerant. We're constantly moving around. I've moved around a lot with my art, and a lot of my family had never moved around. Like my mother's family, my father's family, they're just sort of, that's where they're from and that's where they've always been, and I moved around. And I find places interesting. I find like histories around industry and landscape very interesting, and I suppose you collect those experiences, and then they all sort of slowly form the work. But yeah, I don't know if I answered that well, but I think
Something about that non-built.
Yeah, some things are unorganised and other things are more specific because obviously it's where you live, so you have to go and experience that where you live, and then you start to sort of delve into that place, and then that sort of takes on, it's brought into the work in some way. So I think it does change you when you live and when you work, and responding to that and the landscape around you, you know, whether you're in an urban space or whether you're out in the landscape. So yeah, I think that's something I always sought after. You know, it's definitely kind of been a big part of the work.
Okay, one more question, and then I will open up the floor, or whatever the expression is. I sort of half don't want to end on this because it sounds like I'm kind of writing this as a script for you, which I kind of know isn't the case either. But I'm really interested in having, you know, this some of this body of work has evolved through your role as a parent, your life as a parent, and I wonder how much the domestic and the sort of parental experience informs this work.
I think about that sort of division of labour, and I think that's the thing of it really, is that things are kind of collected, so often I don't get I'm not full time on it, so I get these snatches of time, so I have to be really kind of clever with my time, and then, you know, there's a time for everything, isn't there? So there's a time when you have to kind of, I think, you know, also I do a lot of crossing over of things. When my son was a lot younger, I used to sort of, okay, we're going to go on a walk now, so I'll be going to collect things, but you'd be going on a walk, so a lot of crossing over of things, and I've tried to do that quite a bit, and thinking about how, as humans, you know, I remember sort of playing as a child down on the beach, right next to the nuclear power station, and actually playing with all the sort of stones on the sands and not really noticing the nuclear power station I was playing next to, but the sort of the kind of the play in all of that, and the sort of the imagination that we get, and enjoying seeing that through him, you know, through the everyday events of things. And I think that has brought a whole new element into my sculpture, just that sort of play really. I suppose I think it does definitely make me change. I think the scale as well. The scale is that it's quite a big. I have to think about how I can carry things and how I can make things within what I have. And so I get these snatches of time where I work solidly on something, then I have it's almost like a downtime where I don't make as much. And it's like that. I think that's how I've kind of kept it going, really.
And is that that idea of an art practice that is the size for your life, instead of an art practice that breaks your life? You know, that kind of fit between what it is, you know, the daily practice of being a human and this body of work, I think is particularly entangled and got really it's part of the register of the work.
I think also the thing about having these snatches of time. So when I was making some work, I only had say 2 or 3 days in the foundry. The rest of the time I'm teaching or I'm, you know, at home doing that other kind of side, being mother, but actually thinking, right, I have to be really mindful about what I'm doing. I have to really sort of enjoy every part of this sort of practice, because even the banal jobs are really, you know, you can get a lot from that. So it's kind of really, I think that's what's informed it as well, just bringing in these different approaches to our kind of contact with materials, and the importance of that, because everything is about the detail, isn't it, in our lives. We've got to be careful about, you know, how we sort of tend to the detail, not to sort of you've got to sort of try and attempt to do things as best you can with maybe less things, but more in depth, rather than trying to do too many things. That's what I'm trying to kind of live towards, but it doesn't always work. But I think that's what's definitely kind of helped me sort of know, you know, the procrastination maybe has gone away. I don't have much time to procrastinate. I've just got to kind of get on with it.
That's really interesting. Over to you.
Can I start?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I've just been like really enjoying looking at these things behind you, and I have a few questions about like how they're made, or like kind of somewhere between a comment and a question, because to me they've got that kind of like almost an exquisite corpse vibe in it, like the surrealist game, and this sort of possibility, and you know, my imagination goes on a trip of like we could walk out of these rooms and I mean, they might now be glued, but that they could all reassemble themselves in another order. So I guess I wanted to know, like, were these like conceived as a series, or did they just happen to be put together in this display cabinet? And you know, in this kind of world where you've got your like magical boxes of collected objects, like, you know, what do you pick up first to start playing this game of what balances in what?
That's a great question, Catherine. Thank you. I think usually what it is, I introduce something new. So I brought something in the studio which I just found, like for example that flint there, I found particularly exciting because it had a hole in it. Mm-hmm. They're called hagstones, aren't they? They're supposed to be like magical, and in Scandinavia you collect them and you thread them up on a piece of string and hang them outside your house. So that already had this kind of connotation of, you know, I don't know, Heckworth, all these sort of sculptors in the past who have enjoyed the void in the stone. And so it started with that, and then how do I animate this object? How do I bring this into being? It sort of, what does it tell me as an object? Because I've got all these trays, plastic trays of things, I started to kind of just compose it. And what happens is that I found I had this little cup that I'd made, I chainsawed that. I had this sort of chainsaw wood sculpture period, and I did a residency in Lübeck in Germany many years ago, and that was my first attempt, you know, with this chainsaw, and I don't know how I managed to do a tiny cup, but anyway, I was doing that. That was been kicking around my studio for years. That had been my studio from about 1992. So it had been there, I didn't know what to do with this. So it's this weird cup, it looks like teeth. You know, it looked like it was a body, but and it just sat perfectly with the flint. There was a bit of the flint where it formed, and it sat on top of the edge of the cup upside down. So there's a play, and then I also had these. They're a bit like casts in a play, you know. So you've got a new character that you bring in. It's a bit like that. It's a sort of sculptural play. There's a sort of, and these can be very slow and very quick to make, which is why I quite like these different. Some of the things like this is a very slow piece, but to have these other quicker pieces which are very much about the moment. And I don't know if I've said this, there's an anecdote about my studio at the moment, it's a very noisy studio, and it's right next to a gym, and they're kind of lifting weights, dropping them, and it's like boom. And I've been playing around with all these objects, balancing, and the table's shaking, you know. And it's like there are bodies on the other side of this wall trying to get fit and be in the world and be strong, and I'm balancing all the rubble and the relics of being in the world, and they're all falling around. There's a kind of comedy element in that, you know, if you was to sort of film the two spaces, you know, concurrently, like the artist sort of labouring over the materials, and then someone else listening to really loud music, playing with weights. But yeah, it's very much a kind of dialogue with the objects. I feel like they're kind of talking to me, you know, in that way that objects do. They sort of suggest things to you, because there's a sort of interplay, really, you know, like with the old lipstick and the cuckoo clock weight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. This is really interesting. I think I want to come back to the question of time and kind of think about that in relation to this space, and perhaps I hear a bit more about the decisions that you've made, because I'm kind of thinking about this as this show will feel very different in an industrial type space than it does, or even in a purpose-built museum, natural history museum, than it does in this very domestic space. And I'm assuming this is a kind of late Georgian building at the time of kind of all this expansion, colonial expansion and collecting, you know, this sort of gathering that would have happened. And so probably in this very kind of living room, perhaps there would have been stuff kind of rounded up by the sort of various dilettantes that there were, you know, and people had dinner parties, didn't they? And kind of, you know, oh, look what I've got, you know. So I'm thinking about how So there must have been quite a lot of decisions that you've made about the use of a domestic space and the time of the now within this space, because this space isn't the space that it was when it was built.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, no, definitely. I've always really had I've always drawn to the space, Danielle's gallery. It's got that kind of rich historical context to it, but the kind of layout of it is that it's almost like a model for most homes, isn't it? If you look at the history of houses and homes, you can go right back. Is it Scarborough in the north of Scotland, where you look at these sort of Mesolithic, but there's these stone dwellings underground, and they've got like a mantelpiece, they've got a stone shelf, and it's like that's the beginnings of a kind of a space to live in. And so in a way, this building, it's got everything in it. It's got that history of materials, like you say, that kind of colonial expansion of materials, but and in London as well. So it's got this domestic scale, but what I tried to do was to sort of play around with the space. So I was showing you earlier, it wasn't in my sketchbook, because I sort of mapped out when I was meeting with Danielle and Matilda about where pieces would go. And I was just thinking about the relation between the architectural structures in here and like things like this is a bit like a kind of it's a frame, isn't it? It's a natural frame. It's like you get this kind of view, and it has this sort of like you say, it's this sort of slightly glamorous quality to it, because it's a vitrine, it's a show. And I've always been interested in that history of collecting and collections, the Wunderkammer, and that whole history of objects and how they were being primed and brought in from different parts of the world. But my family have had this, like my grandfather was a plumber, and so he used to collect objects, but he'd collect all the bath taps that he took out, and he had a drawer full of, it's hilarious, a drawer full of bullcocks, from old sort of water tanks, and so this is how I was brought up, and like all these different kind of objects, and in this way that's a kind of Wunderkammer in itself. But there is that kind of, oh yeah, that's useful, we'll keep that. But there is also that history of, that's an amazing object. Is it animal, or is it vegetable, or is it a human-made object? There's something in our kind of humanness that we like, whatever period it's from, for what different means and for different ends, that kind of collecting, is there in us somewhere. But yeah, I tried to kind of pair up objects with space, like this one here. When I was working with Danielle, we were talking about the spaces, that this kind of looks out the window, and there's a sort of sense of the view and the pairing of the nightscapes either side of the symmetry of the fireplace. And trying to think about the kind of the history of the space as well.
Thank you.
The bracket pieces work particularly well.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that.
Well,
I was interested. Yeah, because I suppose there would have been more. I don't know. Maybe in the past, Danielle, perhaps there would have been cornicing at some point. I don't know if it ever had any in this room. No one knows. But that kind of playing with the sort of the architrave and the sort of that a lot of those plasterwork details which aren't in this house. But I was thinking about that. They do come from looking at nature, where the sort of things are cast in sections, and they're usually the Baroque, those kind of scrolls of the Baroque, and these sort of the folds and the swags of fabric, which are mimicking nature in some way, where things grow and fold. I tried to bring that out with the kind of objects, really, the way they were placed in the rooms.
No more questions? Or you can continue afterwards anyway. So thank you immensely. That was really fabulous. Thank you, Becky. Thank you very much for going to do the talk.
My pleasure. Thank you.